Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the NOAA Central Library. I am Katie Rowley, the Outreach and Reference Librarian who will be hosting this. If you do have any questions or technical issues during the webinar, please place your question or your issue into the question panel. The question panel will also be where you place your questions to ask our speaker today. We will be holding all questions until the end. And with that housekeeping out of the way, I would like to introduce Laura Ormland, who is the NOAA Citizen Science Co-Coordinator, who will then introduce our speaker for today. Laura?
Thanks, Katie. Very excited to have Caitlin Mandeville with us here today. Caitlin has been part of our citizen science community going back to her New Hampshire days, or I'm sorry, New Hampshire Sea Grant days, where she served as their citizen science outreach coordinator. I happened to see her giving a talk on this topic at the ESA meeting this past year, and this is a topic that I think is important for a lot of our NOAA projects, and very excited to have her with us today to talk about her research. She's currently pursuing her PhD research on analysis approaches and conservation applications of citizen science species observation data at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. There, she's part of an interdisciplinary research team approaching this topic from many angles, including data quality, modeling methods, social science, and many more. She completed her MS degree at the University of Wyoming, and as I mentioned before, she was the Citizen Science Outreach Coordinator for New Hampshire Sea Grant before beginning her PhD research. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Laura. All right, so hi, everyone. Thanks for being here listening today, and of course thanks to NOAA for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking about this work that my colleagues and I are doing with citizen science species occurrence data. So I will jump right in. All right, quick introduction. Laura really covered it, but like she said, I'm a PhD student here at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, or NTNU. My research focus is listed there below. I just finished my first year, and the work I'm going to talk about today represents a part of the work that I and some colleagues have been focusing on during that first year. So, of course, before I go on much farther, I need to introduce the rest of that team. Like Laura said, I'm part of a close working group of 6 PhD students who are shown on the left here, and 6 PIs who are shown on the right, plus some external collaborators whose logos are shown on the far right. And co-authors of the work that I'm sharing today are marked with an asterisk. So the goal of this group is to take an interdisciplinary approach to improving analysis methods for citizen science species occurrence data. And the review work that I'm going to discuss today has a goal of laying some groundwork for the rest of our research. And I'd say that this review that I'm going to share is kind of at a late in progress stage. We've done most of the analyses that we had planned, and we're kind of in the process of writing up what we found with the intention of submitting for publication relatively soon. And so today I'll share a subset of these results with you. All right, so working with species occurrence data from citizen science. First off, I think I should cover what do I mean by species occurrence data. When I say this, I'm talking about unstructured observations of species. So this type of data is produced by many citizen science programs. Think of apps like iNaturalist, where volunteers submit sightings of species. There's not usually a structured sampling design, and sightings come to researchers often with very little context. The data are typically collected opportunistically, not through any kind of structured design, and there's typically no absence or non-detection measures. And a closely related point is that there's generally little to no measure of observer effort, so absences can't be inferred. So you don't know, essentially, if there are areas that have no observations or spots where the species is not present, or just places where people haven't looked for it. Because of the unstructured nature of the data collection, spatial and temporal biases are hard to quantify. Of course, all data collection has some of these biases, but in more traditional data collection, it's a lot easier to understand and account for them, but it's harder with unstructured data. Then finally, in the literature, you'll see many names for this type of data. You might hear primary biodiversity data, or incidental sightings, or opportunistic observations, things like that. So the amount of this data available to researchers is growing really quickly. And there's kind of two parallel reasons for this. First, this type of citizen science is growing really quickly. And second, and just as importantly, there's been a real revolution in digitizing old museum collections, making a lot of this type of information available online for the first time. So increasingly, species occurrence data from these two sources are aggregated in open, accessible databases. The logos shown here are from some of the biggest and most well-known, but there's probably hundreds to thousands of small databases that target more specific regions or taxa as well. Just to give you a sense of the type of numbers that we're talking about, this is a now slightly outdated figure from the website of GBIF, or the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is a major repository of this type of data. It shows the growth of species occurrence data that's available on GBIF. The number of observations numbers well over 1 billion. So if you're new to publicly available species occurrence data and just want to get a sense of what's out there, I recommend just starting out right here on gbif.org and exploring that. Okay, so having defined the type of data we're interested in, I just want to briefly discuss where this research fits into the broader world of citizen science. And the main point that I want to make here is that the type of citizen science projects that produce the sort of data I'm talking about today are just a small subset of citizen science. Ecological citizen science can range from volunteers working really closely with researchers on kind of nuanced long-term projects, all the way to an individual submitting a single sighting of a species with no further engagement with the project. With some exceptions, the type of data I'm talking about today come more from the latter side of that spectrum. All types of citizen science along the spectrum have a lot of value to offer, so I'm definitely not making like a value statement right here, but I just want to make sure that if anyone who's listening isn't super familiar with citizen science, I don't want to leave you with the impression that the type of citizen science I'm covering in this talk is the only type of citizen science out there. And on a very related note, the world of citizen science research is broad and diverse, and it covers a lot more than how to analyze the data that citizen science produces. Citizen science programs often have goals of developing science literacy or including the community in environmental decision making, democratizing the scientific process, and so on. I definitely don't have room to get into the many varied goals of citizen science in this talk, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't hint that the citizen science I'm covering today is really just the tip of the iceberg. So if you want to learn more about citizen science as a whole, I'll put some resources on the screen right here that are just a really general starting point. So if that's kind of what you're looking for, hopefully some of these resources are informative for that. But back to the topic of today's talk. So unstructured species occurrence data are an incredible resource for researchers, but they do come along with unique analysis challenges. In addition to the lack of absence data, measures of observer effort, and the biases that are difficult to quantify, there are some questions of variable data quality. Now, again and again, peer-reviewed studies have made it pretty clear that citizen science can produce data that's of the same quality as professionally collected data. And for the most part, citizen science programs and data repositories are going to be pretty transparent about the validation and quality control measures that they take. But as with any method, of course, there's still questions of data quality. These can be quality concerns with both the species, like was the species ID'd correctly, and also concerns of quality with the location part of the data. Was the location recorded accurately, and what's the spatial resolution? So given these challenges, there's a very quickly growing body of research on how to deal with these challenges and how to draw as much research value as possible from unstructured data. So this brings us to the objective of our systematic review. We know that there's a ton of research being done on how to analyze unstructured data, and our working group is aiming to contribute to that conversation ourselves. But at the starting point, we really found ourselves wondering more about the status quo and realizing that there wasn't a lot in the literature to kind of characterize that status quo. We wanted to compile all of the papers that we could from the peer-reviewed literature that use unstructured data and use them to address these two really simple questions. First, how are unstructured data reported and analyzed in the literature? What are the most common analysis approaches? And second, are there patterns that relate to the selection of analysis approach? And if there are patterns, are they instructive for researchers who might be trying to select an analysis approach themselves? So there are a lot of great resources out there on how to conduct a systematic review, and we took advantage of a lot of those. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the methods of our review, but I would be happy to chat more about this with anyone later if you're interested. Just really briefly, our search strategy boiled down to two main approaches, which we both of which were conducted through Web of Science. So first, we searched for papers whose abstracts contained one of 25 different terms representing unstructured data, and one of 18 different terms representing biodiversity data. And then we also conducted a parallel search for papers whose abstracts contain the name of some common platforms that aggregate this type of data. In total, the search produced over 3,000 articles, which we screened for relevance at abstract level, and we ended up retaining 1,419 articles, which we used for abstract level and bibliometric analyses. Beyond that, we randomly selected 150 paper subsample for some full text analyses. Oh, I'm so sorry. Did I just say that? There we go. All right. So if anyone is interested in more about the way that we went about developing this review strategy, here's a quick list of some of the resources that we found most helpful. And again, I'd be happy to take questions or talk more about this later if anyone's interested in this part. But for now, I'll dive into some of our results, starting with just some quick observations about the structure of our set of papers. So our search returned results from 1992 to 2019. You can see that authorship is spread over many individuals. There were a total of over 5,700 authors in our set of papers, and this figure shows that the number of papers contributed by the top 50 of them, so less than 1% of the total authors in our set. You can see that it quickly drops off to fewer than 5 papers per author after the top 20 people. Next, we can see that there are a relatively small number of highly cited documents and a much larger number of not so highly cited documents. The top 4 papers, by far the most highly cited, are 4 of the foundational papers about Maxent, which is a species distribution modeling method that's common for presence-only data. We'll talk more about that later. And finally, we can see that influential papers tend to be spread over many different journals. Okay, now let's dig in a little deeper. We clustered all of the documents in our set by broad topic area. And this figure here is the result of that LDA topic modeling. This is a method that uses the distribution of words among documents, in this case, the abstracts in our set of papers, to arrange them into topic clusters along 2 axes. And we can dig into each of these topics to get a sense of the main types of documents in our set. So to help with interpreting these clusters, I created a word cloud of all the words used more than 100 times in the papers in each cluster. So starting with this top left brighter purple cluster, and I'll walk through all of them briefly, we can see that the words standing out relate primarily to simple collections of species records. So I'm naming this the records cluster for now. The darker purple at the bottom left is pretty similar. It's still mostly about the collection of data, though it trends a bit more towards terms that suggest a little more interpretation, things like migration or population, breeding. These themes are the focus of a lot of citizen science monitoring programs, so I've gone ahead and labeled this cluster monitoring for now. Might not be a perfect fit, but that's okay. We're just kind of broadly getting to know the data. And then moving to the other side of the x-axis in the orange cluster, the words are more methodological: presence, absence, spatial predictions. So we can view this left to right axis roughly as a transition from simple reporting of observations to more methodological papers about what to do with these observations. And then in the middle, we've got some more specific applications of methods. The words are more applied than in the orange cluster, but they're not as straightforward as the purple terms. In this yellow cluster, we've got things like climate, models, range, distribution. And then in pink, we have words like habitat, suitability, conservation. Similar to the yellow cluster, these are terms that suggest the application of analysis methods to empirical questions. So now, with a little content analysis done, we can start exploring the full data set. This figure is interesting because it shows that we were wrong kind of right off the bat with an expectation that we had going into this analysis. We expected that methodological papers would be increasing rapidly. In fact, we can see that while the total population rate is definitely increasing, the farthest right bar in the graph is 2019, so it's not a complete year. The method papers aren't growing quite as fast as we would have expected. Most of the growth is actually due to the applied papers, and an increasing percentage of the papers are applied papers. In fact, the fastest growing topics appear to be the two kind of records focused topics. Now, this figure is a different way of looking at things. This represents citation linkages between documents in our set of papers. Each dot represents a paper, and the placement of dots represent citation linkages. Papers are placed near papers that they cite or that they're cited by. And then the size of the dot correlates with the number of linkages. So papers that cite or are cited by a lot of papers in our set are shown as large, and papers that do not share citation linkages within the set are small. And the colors indicate the same topic clusters as before. Now, one interesting thing to note here is the shape of this figure. The more connected papers are in two distinct hubs. Applied papers in the range shifts and habitat categories are basically clustered around the method papers. This isn't that surprising because we'd expect method papers to be highly cited by papers using those methods. It's interesting, though, that the more records-focused papers are quite separate. And the majority of the unconnected papers in the outer circle around that sort of inner cluster are also in those two records categories as well. It's hard to say exactly what this means just from this figure, but there are some possibilities that stand out. Other research, including a great review that came out earlier this year by Ball-Damrow and colleagues, I'll talk more about it later, has found that rates of data citation among papers that use primary biodiversity data are relatively low. So given that trend, it's possible that the results we're seeing here reflect that trend, that these data represent either an underused source of data, or that if the data in these records papers are being reused, they're not being cited as much. Now, looking at these citation trends over time, we can see that the method papers are clearly the most cited, but the rate at which they're cited compared to the other papers is actually dropping off in recent years. We can see in the past 5 years or so, a greater proportion of citations have gone to the applied papers. Of course, it's possible that the methods papers just don't gain citations as quickly, or it's possible that researchers who initially started using certain methods that were popular back when interest in this sort of data first spiked in the early 2000s aren't willing to move on to newer methods now. It's hard to say for sure, but a lesson here does seem to be that as the literature gets more saturated with method papers about unstructured data, it's going to be more important for those who are writing these method papers to make it really clear how and why innovations and methods should be adopted by those analyzing this type of data. This lesson is backed up by the findings of a paper that came out about a year ago, which argues that there are two main barriers to ecological models influencing management and conservation decision-making. The first of these barriers is that managers often perceive models as kind of a black box and are unwilling to trust the models when they can't fully understand them. And the second barrier is difficulty in communicating uncertainty about modeling results. So among other things, this paper argued that two solutions might include better communication from methods-focused researchers to more applied researchers, and also the implementation of user interfaces like Shiny apps, for example, that make innovations easier to use. We think that these two solutions might be really applicable to the sharing of methods related to unstructured data analysis as well. So to get more in-depth answers about our set of papers, we realized we needed to read the full text and manually extract information from at least some of them. This is because a lot of the things we're interested in either don't tend to be described in the abstract of papers, or they're described in so many different ways that they're basically impossible to detect through automated searching methods. So at this point, we've taken the approach of randomly subsampling 150 papers, which is a bit over 10% of our full data set. We settled on this number because it was a large enough subset to not be as sensitive to changes with the addition of more papers to that subset. So here you're seeing the basic stats on this 150 paper subsample. As you can see, it's pretty representative of the full data set, which is on the left, in terms of publishing year and the distribution of the various topics. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going into some of what we've learned by looking at this 150 paper subsample. Here we're looking at the habitat type and the study species of each paper in the subsample. And for most of these stats, I'm going to have them broken down by those same topic areas just for that context. Obviously, the terrestrial studies are the best represented. Looking at the taxa, plants are the best represented, followed by invertebrates, birds, and then mammals. This corresponds really well to results from the paper that I mentioned earlier, the review by Baldamaro and colleagues that came out earlier this year. They considered some similar questions to some of the questions that we're considering, using a subset of 501 papers that use data available from publicly accessible primary biodiversity databases. This public accessibility was not a requirement of our study, so we were looking at a pretty different subset, but some similar questions. And these researchers found a very similar pattern in terms of what taxa were most represented, gave some theories as to why that was the case, in particular, the high prevalence of plants in digitized collections. So back to our data set, looking at the broad region where studies were conducted, although the numbers of papers vary quite a bit from region to region, it was encouraging to me to see that the methodological research is pretty well distributed around the globe, rather than being primarily from any one region. We also wanted to see more specifically where exactly the unstructured data in these papers are coming from. And a big lesson from this work so far is that not all unstructured data comes from citizen science, and not all of it even originates as unstructured. Just under a third of the studies in our subsample state that their data come at least in part from citizen science. Of course, it's very possible that more of the studies did use citizen science but didn't describe it as such. And in fact, the research kind of suggests that that might be the case. Studies, including this 2014 +1 study by Karen Cooper and colleagues, have found that citizen science tends to be undercredited. And it's our experience from conducting this review that it is, in fact, often pretty hard to tell if a study actually used citizen science or not. Methods are sometimes described pretty obscurely in a way that it's not very clear upon just reading the paper. In the future, we definitely hope to see clearer attribution of data collection to citizen scientists when that would be appropriate. Not only does this give credit to the citizen scientists who did the work of collecting that data, which is important, but it also serves to advocate for the value that citizen science adds to research. So the biggest source of unstructured data in our subsample is actually what we called mixed source. This covers data that comes from historical sources with unknown structure, which is a lot of natural history collections. And it also covers data where multiple data sets were merged and reformatted to the lowest common denominator of presence-only unstructured data. This kind of merging and reformatting is really common. Many studies in our subsample contain some data that had more structure and metadata, but that structure and metadata was ignored so that the data could be combined with presence-only data. This is definitely necessary in a lot of cases, but we would encourage data users to think critically about how much value unstructured data will add to their research before choosing to ignore information from some of their data. Because in some cases where there are abundant data, you might actually get the most informative results without even including the unstructured data. And there's also a growing research on integrative modeling methods where you can integrate various types of data within one model rather than reverting to the lowest common denominator. I've shown one recent example here in the paper at the top of the screen. It's co-authored by the head of our citizen science working group. It kind of reviews this idea of integrative modeling. So if that's something you're interested in, I would definitely recommend starting with this resource. I should also point out that about 15% of the papers in our subsample use either presence-absence data or data that otherwise has some kind of structure, and reduces that data to an unstructured format before analyzing it. When this is done in methods papers, this is often to facilitate a comparison between different methods, which is definitely understandable and valuable. But it's a little concerning to us to see that this is also the case for a good handful of papers in the other topics. The other paper that I'm showing on the screen here is a 2013 review by Yaklik and colleagues, which kind of detected and pointed out at the time that it was a common mistake for unstructured analysis methods to be used on data that do have more structure. So it's a little concerning that our results sort of suggest that this is still an ongoing issue. Now, looking at the more specific sources of data, it's interesting to see there are a lot of different types of data that are being used even in this relatively small subsample. A fair amount, although smaller than expected, of studies do use publicly accessible data, but it's interesting to note that a lot of it came from places that aren't necessarily super intuitive to find. 35% came from public databases, but databases that are relatively small or related to a niche geographic region or a niche taxa. So they're not necessarily things that are going to be really easy for a lot of other people to find. 11% of studies used data from GBIF. 19% used data from the literature and 10% used museum data. So these are relatively accessible to the public or to other researchers, but they are time consuming to reproduce if these authors don't make the data that they've compiled from these various sources available in one central place when their study is finished. And some studies use data that aren't necessarily publicly accessible at all. A third used original data and 8% used data from local management agencies. So in some cases, they might have made these data publicly available after they were done using it. Hopefully a lot of them did, but that's not usually clear from the papers that we read in this subsample anyway. So as we sort of expected to see, when we're looking at the types of analyses that these papers used, the majority of our subsample used some kind of species distribution modeling methods, but there really was a variety of approaches taken. A lot of papers reported summary statistics instead of modeling results, and several papers just reported the observations without analysis. We were also intrigued by a handful of papers that used some creative methods to look at things like abundance, population dynamics, species richness, and other things that go beyond distribution. There were some additional creative uses of the unstructured data as well. In two papers, unstructured or presence-only data were used to design an experiment, just kind of to lay the groundwork and decide how the experiment that would collect more unstructured or more structured data should proceed. In 4 papers, this unstructured data was used to validate analyses that were conducted with more structured data. And in 17 papers, unstructured data were integrated with other types of species data. Now, considering just those papers that used some kinds of species distribution modeling methods, and then just briefly cover what types of methods they used. So in our 150 paper subsample, there were 48 distinct modeling methods. So that's an enormous diversity of analysis approaches. I'm displaying this figure without labels right now because it's too big, you wouldn't be able to read it anyway. And I just mostly want to give you a sense of the skewed distribution. The only thing I want you to note here is the overwhelming prevalence of maxent, which is a very common species distribution modeling approach for presence-only data. And note also the way that the topic areas are distributed. The vast majority of applied papers that do use species distribution modeling choose to use maxent. The majority of other species distribution modeling approaches seem to be mainly used in methods papers and don't seem to have caught on quite as much in the applied papers. Yeah. And now, to give you a little better sense of what some of those other methods are, I've zoomed in to just show you the top 10 methods that were used in species distribution modeling papers. So their names are listed at the bottom there. We looked but didn't find any substantial patterns between the choice of modeling method and other study variables, and we think that this is probably mostly because maxent was so dominant in our data set that the sample size for the other methods was quite small. So, as I'm nearing the end of my talk, I think it makes sense to kind of look back and ask, so we've learned a lot of things from our set of papers. I think it's important to consider, is our set of papers representative, of the type of papers that we intended it to represent? And one way to get at this question is to compare our data set with other sort of similar data sets. So we did this. We compared our set of papers with the 841 papers that cited or mentioned GBIF data in 2018. So these are all papers that are known to use this type of unstructured data. They use data that came from GBIF. And in spite of the fact that we had about 300 papers in our data set from 2018, there was relatively little overlap. And I think this says something important about the real challenge of understanding how unstructured data are used, and even more basic questions like how much unstructured data is available. I'm honestly not too surprised that our search terms failed to capture many papers that cite GBIF. Because, for example, if the use of unstructured data is just a smaller aspect of a study, it probably won't be mentioned in the abstract. And as the analysis of unstructured data becomes more mainstream, researchers might be less inclined to describe that type of data explicitly just because it's not as interesting. On the other hand, though, I think that this makes it clear that our review really reveals that if you limit a search for papers that use unstructured data to known publicly accessible databases, you're going to miss a really large number of studies that actually do this type of analysis, but primarily use data that come from a wider variety, a more heterogeneous variety of sources. So I think our review contributes a lot of important things to this conversation and perhaps raises more questions than answers, I guess, is a good thing. Ultimately, I think it really speaks to the need to continue making data sharing and citation a big priority. Not only does data sharing make the data more accessible and reusable, but also when data are aggregated, it makes it easier for researchers to find and understand trends in the analysis approaches that are being used for that type of data. So before I finish up my talk, I want to highlight a couple of take-home points that kind of stood out to me, both for researchers and for anyone who manages a citizen science program that collects species occurrence data. So starting out with some take-home points for researchers. First of all, there's so much data out there. If there's a way to use it, use it. And if you use it, definitely cite it. Citing data incentivizes the sharing of data by crediting those who published it, which just means that there will be more data shared around. and it'll be easier to understand and detect trends and learn from the way that those data are used. Avoid common pitfalls in the analysis of this type of data. The third point, I guess, is a bit of a caution. Examples of effective use of this type of data are really spread out. It's a hard trend to characterize. Looking for examples of ways that this type of data is used effectively, I would recommend considering review papers. The Ball-Damrow paper that I referenced is a great point to start. Hopefully our review will be out sooner than later, and that should be another helpful resource on this front. GBIF also publishes annual reports of ways that their data were used, and that's another great starting point. If you have species occurrence data, definitely consider publishing it. And I'd recommend getting familiar when it comes to publishing data with the FAIR principles for data management. If you go to this website that's listed on the slide, gofair.org, it's a great resource for really practical, actionable steps to take to make sure that when you're sharing data, it is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Basically, the principles that make it possible for others to use it and integrate it with other sources of data, indefinitely into the future. I wanted to make sure to draw out some take-home points for those who are maybe running programs that collect this type of data as well. The biggest thing that really stood out to me is just be encouraged by the knowledge that your data are valuable. You really never know what your data could end up being used for. And so definitely share that encouragement with citizen scientists as well. Of course, publish the data if possible, adhering to FAIR data principles as much as you can. Of course, striving for high quality data, and really the more metadata that can be included and kept with the original data, the better. It opens up so many more analysis opportunities. And then finally, if your data come from citizen science and you're publishing them, definitely make it clear that that's where the data come from. Not only does this credit the citizen scientists, but it also clearly documents the value of citizen science in the literature, which I think is important. So if you have made it this far, thanks again for listening. I'll take questions in just a second. But before I do, I just want to express that if you're interested in any of the topics that I covered, we'd really love to hear from you. If you have thoughts on our review or important questions that you think it seems like the review might be missing and so on, please do get in touch. And if you're interested in discussing any of our working groups' work with unstructured data analysis in other contexts, also definitely get in touch. And finally, for me personally, the next steps in my research are going to involve applying some of the innovations that are developed within our working group in the context of conservation decision making. So if you have a conservation or a management related data set that's just begging to be used as a test case for this kind of work, I'd love to hear about that also. But with that, again, I'd like to just give a big thank you to NOAA for giving me this chance to talk, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Caitlin. We do have a question online, and if a few of you out there are mulling your questions over, please place them into the question panel, and even if we don't get to them, I will send them on to Caitlin for her to answer offline. So our first question is, citizen science data can sometimes have a high degree of inaccuracy, especially in regards to elusive species or in areas of low human population density. Does your research look at potential quality assurance, quality control methods that authors reference for getting around this issue?
Yeah, that's a really big topic. Let's see. So to make a long story short, I guess it's definitely something that we're looking at. I think really the only way to generalize about this is to say that it's something that should ideally be considered on a case-by-case basis. And again, the more information you have about how the data was collected, the better. A lot of this comes down to the platform the data was collected on and the methods that that particular platform takes for ensuring data quality. There's steps that can be taken, in analysis as well, in terms of flagging unusual points or aggregating data in a way that kind of eliminates some of these issues. Yeah, I mean, short answer is yes, we're considering it, and I wish I had like a one-size-fits-all answer, but I don't really. But I would love to talk about it in greater detail if the questioner wants to reach out later and talk in greater detail.
Thank you, Caitlin. I will pass along
Yeah.
their name. We do have another question about your thoughts or comments on the Audubon Christmas bird count and its use in trends, if you are familiar.
I am familiar, not a lot like on the back end, so might or might not be able to answer the question, but you can go for it and I'll see what I can do.
I believe that was the question, was like, what are your thoughts on that? Or if you have any comments on their use of trends in the bird count.
Got it, okay. I haven't really worked with that personally, so I guess I don't want to comment, but thank you for the question. Familiar.
No problem. And we do have a few more questions, sorry. Sure. Next question is, what are your thoughts regarding the integration of data collection into digital formats, means of making the leap from paper to digital form?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's necessary. It's important. I think that's what's driven a lot of this increase in the accessibility of this type of data, right? Digitizing historical records, often decades, hundreds of years old, has just opened up so much new data and allowed for so many new types of analyses, and considering more modern data that's on paper versus digital form, I think it's a really similar question. Of course, needs to be done carefully, needs to be done accurately, but it's really the only way to ensure that data are going to last and be shareable and findable by anyone. I'm not sure if that fully answered the question.
No, I'm sure that was great. Thank you, Kayla.
Okay.
And I think I'm just going to wrap it up with one more question, and maybe we can flip back a slide or two. We did have a question that there's a small ecology education center in Alaska that facilitates a number of community-based monitoring citizen science projects, especially in intertidal and marine environments, not plants. So do you have any suggestions for ways we can make the data we collect more useful to researchers? And I know you had a slide about that, so if you wanted to go back a slide or two and maybe expand.
Yeah. Yes, just, is this the slide you were thinking of?
It was this one or possibly the one before that.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it could be either one, really.
Yeah.
There's certainly overlap in like the populations that these two slides are talking to.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's a great question, and really appreciate any program that's thinking about issues like this. Let's see. I mean, the biggest thing, not to sound like a broken record, but definitely the biggest thing is just making sure that the data are somewhere that people are going to find it. I guess we started this review thinking that best practices of sharing data were maybe more common than they are, and a thing that I was surprised by was just that a lot of data are shared in places that like tend to appear, are put online after a study and hosted on a personal website that isn't around in a few years, or who knows, all kinds of things go wrong. So I think just thinking about the longevity of data and how to make sure that it is available into the future, whether that's using an entity that specifically does this, manages data and makes it accessible, so that you can kind of outsource that, putting it on GBIF, something similar, or finding whatever solution works for you. But just thinking about that long-term management, I think, is super important. It's always great, like the more partnerships between end users of data and collectors of data that exist, the better. So if there's any opportunity to directly work with, or at least just start a conversation with researchers who are maybe local, maybe not, who would likely use those data and specifically see what they need as individuals, or somebody kind of keyed into the specifics of that field, that's always a fantastic idea. And then I would definitely just recommend thinking about data sharing, the fair data principles. I think that that is just the best resource that I could send anyone to for thinking about what to include in data, what metadata are important, how should data be shared and stored. There's a lot of really practical tips there. Maybe not every program can jump in and do all of them right away, but I think it's a great way to like frame the conversation and start thinking about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We did have one last question come in. Is there a consensus in dealing with spatial sampling bias in unstructured data?
That's another really great and big question. Is there a consensus? I don't know if I can say there's a consensus. There's definitely a consensus like that it's very important and should be thought about. But given that you're asking this question, I feel like that goes without saying. There are studies that have considered, how frequently that's explicitly addressed, and it's well under 100%. I think that addressing this issue is still something that is that we're working on as a field, and I think a lot of it is like fairly specific to the specifics of your data set. So again, unfortunately, finding it hard to one size fits all answer, but if you're asking this question, you're definitely moving in the right direction, and hopefully some of the resources that suggested on this slide, places where other studies using this type of data are compiled, is a good starting point for thinking about how others have started to address this issue. But it's something that's changing so rapidly, and there is a lot of ongoing research in the area that I think it's pretty difficult to give a one-size-fits-all answer, other than that it's very important to consider.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's it for the questions. I didn't know if Laura had any comments she wanted to make, but if not,
I just wanted to thank Caitlin for giving her talk today, and thank all of our participants for listening in and all their great questions.
Thank you guys. I really appreciated it.
Awesome. If you missed this or you would like to know more, this has been recorded. It will be up on the library's YouTube channel. And if you do have any questions, you can reach out to the library at library.brownbag@noaa.gov, and we would be happy to pass on questions or share these slides with you after the fact. And I think that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.